The calendar read April 15th, 1945. Spring had arrived in northern Germany, but nothing could prepare the British soldiers of the 11th Armoured Division for what they were about to discover behind the barbed wire fences of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Lieutenant John Randall, a Special Air Service officer, and his jeep driver were on a routine reconnaissance mission when they stumbled upon the camp by chance. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Approximately 60,000 prisoners, more dead than alive, were crammed into filthy barracks. Around them lay 13,000 unburied corpses in various stages of decomposition. The stench was overwhelming. Disease, starvation, and death permeated every corner of the camp. This was Bergen-Belsen, and it would become a name synonymous with Nazi horror. Among the captured personnel were 25 women wearing field grey uniforms with skirts and boots. These were the SS Aufseherinnen, female concentration camp guards. They stood in stark contrast to the skeletal figures of the prisoners they had overseen. Their names would later become infamous: Elisabeth Volkenrath, Irma Grese, Hertha Bothe, Hildegard Kambach, Irene Haschke. Some were young, barely in their 20s. Others were career guards who had worked in the Nazi concentration camp system for years. These weren't soldiers captured in battle. They weren't prisoners of war. They were ordinary German women who had volunteered or been conscripted to work as guards in one of humanity's darkest institutions. How did they end up here? What transforms an ordinary factory worker, a dairy farm girl, or a saleswoman into a concentration camp guard? In 1938, the SS began recruiting women to guard female prisoners at Ravensbrück, Germany's main women's concentration camp. The advertisements in newspapers like the Hannoversche Kurier were deceptively simple. They sought German women aged 17 to 45 to guard those who had committed an offence against the folk community at a military installation. The job offer was attractive for women seeking employment or higher pay. It included free housing, prepared meals, and no required qualifications. The ads carefully avoided mentioning concentration camps. For many working-class women during the Nazi era, becoming a guard represented upward mobility. Female guards earned approximately 185 Reichsmarks per month, considerably more than the average wage of 76 Reichsmarks for women in unskilled factory jobs. Take Irma Grese, for example. Born in 1923, she had worked at a dairy farm after leaving school at age 14. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, but was denied entry into nursing programs. At age 18, she claimed the labour exchange sent her to Ravensbrück for guard training, insisting she had no choice. Elisabeth Volkenrath had been an unskilled labourer before becoming a guard. Ruth Closius had wanted to be a nurse, but became a saleswoman instead. These were ordinary women leading ordinary lives until they entered the camp system. But something happened at Ravensbrück during their training. Ideological indoctrination, including propaganda films like Jude Süß, was imposed on new recruits. Former prisoners noted how it took just days for kindness to transform into cruelty. One prisoner observed a young guard arrive at the camp shy and uncertain. Within 4 days, she was beating prisoners with her fists. By 1945, approximately 3,500 women had served as SS Aufseherinnen across the Nazi concentration camp system. At Bergen-Belsen, they oversaw a camp that had descended into absolute horror. Bergen-Belsen had originally been established in 1940 as a prisoner of war camp. In 1943, the SS took over portions of it, converting it into a concentration camp. It was supposed to be an exchange camp, where Jews with foreign passports could be held as leverage in possible prisoner swaps. But in the final months of the war, as Nazi Germany collapsed, Bergen-Belsen became a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps in the east. Death marches brought tens of thousands of emaciated prisoners to a camp already beyond its capacity. The female guards maintained order, or what passed for order in such chaos. Some, like Irma Grese, became notorious for their sadism. Witnesses described how she used a rubber truncheon, pistol, and whip made of cellophane. She forced prisoners to participate in grueling physical exercises called sport, beating them when they collapsed. Others simply turned a blind eye to the suffering around them, following orders in a system designed to dehumanize and destroy. By April 1945, the camp was a scene of unimaginable suffering. Sanitation was non-existent. Typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and dysentery spread unchecked. In the first months of 1945 alone, tens of thousands died. The guards continued their routines even as the camp descended into a living hell. When the British forces approached Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, the German military had negotiated a truce to surrender the camp peacefully, fearing the spread of typhus. Under the agreement, most SS personnel were allowed to leave. Only a small number, including Camp Commandant Joseph Kramer and some guards, remained to uphold order. On April 15th, when Lieutenant Randall and the 11th Armored Division entered the camp, they were completely unprepared for what they encountered. Photographer Harry Oakes, part of the Army Film and Photographic Unit, later recalled, "The bodies were a ghastly sight. Some were green. They looked like skeletons covered with skin. The flesh had all gone." Medical officer William Arthur Wood reflected, "We'd been trained for war wounded. We were used to terrible wounds. But I'm afraid when we got to Belsen, we hadn't been trained for this. And it was so different to anything. I can't explain it. It was so terrible." Brigadier H.L. Glyn Hughes, Deputy Director of Medical Services, informed the military tribunal that would later try the guards. The conditions were indescribable because most of the internees were suffering from some form of gastroenteritis, and they were too weak to leave the hut. The compounds were absolutely one mass of human excreta. The British Army faced an enormous task, providing emergency medical care to 60,000 dying people while dealing with 13,000 corpses that posed a severe health hazard. On April 17th, the remaining SS guards were arrested. 28 men and 25 women were taken into custody. Kramer's deputy tried to hide among the inmates, but was discovered. The British commanders made a decision. The SS guards who had overseen this nightmare would now clean it up. The female guards were ordered to help bury the dead. They would carry the corpses they had once guarded to mass graves. Survivors of the camp watched as their former tormentors were put to work. According to witness accounts and historical records, as the women performed this grim duty, some accounts suggest they were chained together for work details. British officers reportedly told them they would be treated humanely, not as the guards had treated their prisoners. The phrase that echoes through history, though its exact origin remains debated, captured the essential difference. "You're not animals." This was meant to emphasize that unlike the guards' treatment of prisoners, British forces would maintain standards of civilization even toward those who had abandoned all humanity. The female guards worked under the supervision of British soldiers. The task was overwhelming. Even with bulldozers eventually brought in to assist, the burial operation took weeks. Former prisoners gathered to watch. Some taunted their former guards. Others simply stared in silence, processing their liberation while seeing their tormentors brought low. Among the female guards captured at Bergen-Belsen were some of the most notorious figures in the concentration camp system. Elisabeth Volkenrath, aged 26, had served as chief female overseer at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Former prisoners described her as exceptionally cruel, involved in selections for gas chambers. Irma Graeser, only 22 years old, had earned the nickname Hyena of Auschwitz and Beautiful Beast. Despite her angelic appearance, blonde hair, blue eyes, perfect features, she was responsible for unspeakable violence. She had overseen Camp C at Birkenau, which held 30,000 Jewish women from Poland and Hungary. Herta Bode, 24, known as the sadist of Stutthof, had worked at 3 concentration camps. She claimed she only struck prisoners with her hand for discipline and never used instruments or killed anyone, claims that survivors would hotly dispute. Hildegard Kambash and Irene Haschke were among the other guards captured that day, their specific roles documented in the testimonies of survivors. These women had grown up in Nazi Germany, many joining organizations like the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel. They had been indoctrinated in Nazi ideology throughout their formative years. When they entered the camps, they underwent further training that included propaganda films designed to dehumanize prisoners. Less than 5% of female guards were formal members of the Nazi Party, yet they participated in a system that murdered millions. The British moved quickly to bring the perpetrators of Bergen-Belsen to justice. Between September 17 and November 17, 1945, a British military tribunal was convened in Lüneburg to try 45 former members of the camp staff. The proceedings, known as the Belsen trial, were held at number 30 Lindenstrasse. More than 100 international journalists reported on the trial, broadcasting evidence of Nazi atrocities to the world. Survivors testified about the horrors they had endured. They described beatings, starvation, disease, and systematic cruelty. They pointed to the guards who had inflicted suffering upon them. The defendants offered various defenses. Some claimed they were following orders. Others insisted they had been conscripted and had no choice. Many minimized their actions or denied their involvement in specific atrocities. Irma Grese claimed she had only made prisoners exercise because she believed they were capable of such physical activity. She maintained that her actions were justified as discipline. Herta Bauer, in a rare interview years later, said, "Did I make a mistake? No. The mistake was that it was a concentration camp, but I had to go to it, otherwise I would have been put into it myself. That was my mistake." The tribunal was unmoved by such defenses. On November 17, 1945, 11 defendants were sentenced to death, including Camp Commandant Joseph Kramer, head female guard Elisabeth Volkenrath, and 3 other women, Irma Grese, Johanna Bormann, and Camp Dr. Fritz Klein. December 13, 1945. The condemned were transferred to Hamelin prison to await execution. On the morning of December 13, 1945, British executioner Albert Pierrepoint carried out the death sentences. Elisabeth Volkenrath was executed first at 9:34 a.m. Irma Grese followed at 10:03 a.m. According to some accounts, she was sobbing in her cell before the execution. Her final word as she mounted the gallows was "Schnell," quick in German. Johanna Bormann was hanged at 10:38 a.m. Irma Grese was 22 years old. She became the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century. The 3 women, along with their male counterparts, paid the ultimate price for their participation in one of history's greatest crimes. While justice was being served in the courtroom, the real story of Bergen-Belsen was being written in the displaced persons camp nearby. Despite the best efforts of British medical personnel, approximately 14,000 former prisoners died after liberation between April and June 1945. Their bodies were too damaged by starvation and disease to recover. Medical teams led by Brigadier Glyn Hughes worked tirelessly. Specialist teams were dispatched from Britain, including 96 medical student volunteers from London teaching hospitals. Research teams tested various feeding regimes to help the survivors recover. By May 21, 1945, the last prisoners had been moved from Bergen-Belsen to the displaced persons camp at nearby Bergen-Hohne. The concentration camp's huts were burned to the ground to prevent the spread of disease. In total, approximately 50,000 people died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp complex, including Anne Frank and her sister Margot, who perished there in February or March 1945. The Bergen-Belsen DP camp continued to operate until 1951, housing over 12,000 survivors as they rebuilt their lives and searched for surviving family members. The story of Bergen-Belsen's female guards forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. These were not monsters in the traditional sense. Before entering the camps, they were ordinary women leading ordinary lives. They were daughters, sisters, workers. They had dreams and aspirations. Many came from working-class backgrounds and saw guard duty as an opportunity for advancement. Yet within the concentration camp system, they became perpetrators of unimaginable cruelty. Some, like Irma Grese, seemed to relish the power they wielded over helpless prisoners. Others simply went along, following orders in a bureaucracy of death. The question haunts historians and moral philosophers. How do ordinary people become capable of such extraordinary evil? Part of the answer lies in the systematic indoctrination of Nazi ideology. From childhood, many of these women were taught that certain groups were less than human, enemies of the state who deserved no mercy. Part lies in the psychological mechanisms of authority and conformity. When surrounded by others committing atrocities, when orders come from legitimate authorities, when the system itself normalizes cruelty, it becomes easier for individuals to participate. Part lies in the gradual escalation of violence. Guards didn't start by murdering prisoners. They began with small cruelties, then progressively larger ones, until the unthinkable became routine. And part lies in the human capacity for self-deception. Many guards convinced themselves they were simply doing their jobs, following necessary rules, maintaining order in difficult circumstances. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen and the subsequent trials sent shockwaves around the world. Images of the dead, footage of bulldozers pushing bodies into mass graves, photographs of emaciated survivors. These became defining images of Nazi atrocity. Bergen-Belsen became a watchword for Nazi inhumanity and brutality. The trials established precedents for prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity. The testimony of survivors ensured that the world would know what happened. But many female guards escaped justice. Of the approximately 3,500 women who served as SS Aufseherinnen across the concentration camp system, only a fraction were ever brought to trial. Many returned to their ordinary lives, resumed their careers, raised families. Some, like Herta Bothe, lived into old age. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was released early. In interviews, she maintained that her only mistake was being assigned to a concentration camp in the first place. The phrase reportedly spoken to the female guards at Bergen-Belsen, "You're not animals," represents more than just a moment of British military discipline. It represents a fundamental choice about how to respond to evil. The British soldiers who liberated Bergen-Belsen had every reason to treat the guards as the guards had treated their prisoners. They had seen unimaginable suffering. They had witnessed evidence of systematic murder and cruelty. They were angry, horrified, disgusted. Yet they chose to maintain their humanity. They forced the guards to confront their crimes by making them bury the dead. They arrested them and brought them to trial. But they did not descend to the level of those they judged. This distinction matters. It separates justice from revenge, civilization from barbarism, humanity from inhumanity. Today, a memorial stands at the site of Bergen-Belsen. The barracks were burned in 1945, but the grounds remain as a testament to what occurred there. An exhibition includes information about the female guards, their roles in the camp system, and their ultimate fates. Visitors can see photographs of the liberation, read survivor testimonies, and learn about the trials. The British military maintained a presence at Bergen-Belsen on the doorstep of the former camp for 70 years after the war. Soldiers stationed there often visited the memorial. In 2014, 7th Armoured Brigade, the famous Desert Rats, held their last parade as an armoured brigade at Bergen. The local German military commander presented them with a Fahnenband on behalf of his nation, marking a long period of friendship between former enemies. 80 years after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the story of the female guards continues to trouble us. We want to believe that evil is obvious, that monsters are easily identifiable, that we would never participate in such atrocities. The reality is more disturbing. Evil often wears an ordinary face. It can be young and beautiful, like Irma Grace. It can be professional and efficient, like Elizabeth Volkenrath. It can claim to be following orders, doing its duty, just trying to get by. The women captured at Bergen-Belsen remind us that participation in genocide is not limited by gender, age, or social class. The capacity for cruelty exists across all demographics. Given the right circumstances, ideological indoctrination, authoritarian pressure, social conformity, gradual escalation, ordinary people can commit extraordinary crimes. But the story also reminds us that we always have choices. Not all guards were equally cruel. Some showed
occasional kindness to prisoners.
Some were dismissed for being too polite to inmates. Individual agency exists even within oppressive systems. And the British response, treating the captured guards with the standards of civilization even as they brought them to justice, shows that maintaining our humanity in the face of inhumanity is both possible and necessary. On April 15, 1945, when British soldiers entered Bergen-Belsen, they discovered hell on earth. Among those they captured were 25 women in grey uniforms who had helped maintain that hell. In the days that followed, those women were forced to confront the reality of their actions. They carried corpses to mass graves. They faced the survivors who had suffered under their watch. They were arrested, tried, and in some cases executed for their crimes. The phrase that may have been spoken to them, "You're not animals," captures a profound truth. Unlike the guards who had treated their prisoners as subhuman, the British maintained standards of law and order. They provided justice, not revenge. But that phrase also serves as a reminder of what was lost. The women who became concentration camp guards had surrendered their humanity. They had participated in a system designed to dehumanize and destroy. They had become, in their actions if not their nature, something less than fully human. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen did not end suffering for many survivors. Thousands more would die in the weeks and months after British forces arrived. Those who survived carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The female guards paid various prices for their participation. Some were executed. Others served prison sentences. Many escaped justice entirely. But history remembers them. Their photographs, taken after their arrest, show them standing in formation, some defiant, some uncertain, all facing an accounting for what they had done. They were not animals. They were human beings who made terrible choices. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing part of their story. Because if ordinary people can become concentration camp guards, then we must remain vigilant about the conditions that enable such transformation. We must resist ideologies that dehumanize others. We must question authority that demands cruelty. We must maintain our individual moral compass even in systems that reward conformity. The women of Bergen-Belsen stand as a warning from history. They show us what we might become if we fail to guard against the darkness that exists in every human heart. But they also show us the importance of justice, accountability, and maintaining our humanity, even in the face of inhumanity. 8 decades later, their story continues to echo. You're not animals. The question for each generation is whether we will remember that truth and live by it.